United States is not a gentle country. It's a jungle. In the case of Trump, they started on day one, the day after the election, with snide press releases from the DNC about the government knows how to evict trespassers from the White House.
Joe Biden may strangely be the right guy in the right place at the right time.
President Trump was more of he's a movement more than a moment.
So if we can take the next 3 or 4 years and the stability that a Biden presidency might offer, I think we'll be all the better for it.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. Canada is readying for a Democrat-led White House, a change that will have wide-ranging implications for Canadian politics and policy. On today's show, we'll discuss what a Biden presidency means for us, for Canada-U.S. relations, trade and the economy, climate and the energy sector, immigration, relations with China, and of course, the pandemic. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
Democrat Joe Biden secured the U.S. presidency after passing the 270 electoral votes needed to clinch victory. Here are a few numbers to help recap an historic U.S. election. 158 million, the number of Americans who voted in the presidential race, more than 20 million higher than in 2016. 67%. The turnout rate of eligible voters, the highest since 1900. 65 million, the number of votes cast via mail-in ballot. 74 million, the number of ballots cast for Trump,
Y'all ready for this?
earning the second most votes of all time. 80 million, the number of ballots cast for Biden, the most votes cast for any presidential candidate in U.S. history.
So, Peter, what can Canadians expect from Joe Biden as he takes office?
It's not going to be an easy walk with the Biden White House. They've got a policy of basically renationalization of some industries or reindustrialization. They care about a Buy America approach. He's not amenable to the export of our oil through the Keystone pipeline. So there are a bunch of things that are actually real things that we have to negotiate that are going to be tricky for us. That said, I think we're returning to a more predictable time in terms of the relationships between our two countries. So there's order there, but it's not like the challenges have gone away.
Adrian, what do you think? Is it good news or bad news for Canada?
I think it's sort of neutral. I think it's a bit of a calm after the storm, to be sure. There will be some of the predictability that Peter just mentioned in terms of relations. But, everybody normally thinks that having a Democratic president and a liberal prime minister, it's going to be smooth sailing, easygoing. But that's not necessarily the case for a whole host of reasons of which we will be discussing in terms of the individual topics, not most notably our trade and our energy sector. But what I do think is there has been a decent job done, and you certainly know I'm not a one to throw accolades out to the Trudeau Liberals anytime soon, but they've done a decent enough job at sort of navigating the waters with the Trump administration. I don't know if it will be easier with Biden, but it certainly will be more normalized, and I think that is going to be the thing that we look forward to once he is inaugurated in January.
Conrad, how would you describe politics in the Trump era, and how will that change under Biden?
Well, Trump ran, as you will all recall, against all factions of both parties. His slogan was "Drain the Swamp." He said that both parties were complicit in 20 years of misgovernment, endless wars in the Middle East that didn't achieve anything useful, and humanitarian disasters, the greatest economic crisis since the 1930s. The United States being outdistanced by China, 500,000 to 1 million generally unskilled people pouring illegally in over the southern border every year. And he ran against the whole system. And as a result of that, and he put at the top of his list of incompetence the media. And so he was faced with 4 years of Trump hate in the media, just wall-to-wall denigration. Historically, America's so-called allies don't like assertive American presidents. They didn't like Nixon, they didn't like Reagan. they didn't like Trump because they didn't go as far as the Democrats habitually have of collegializing things and pretending that it's one country, one vote in NATO, and there's no disparity of influence and so on. I mean, the world likes weak American presidents, or at least obliging ones, until they need a strong American leader to protect them. And so Canada will be content, I think. I think we'll be fine. I think we'll be fine. But no one should imagine that the Trump wars are over. I mean, he is the only person in that country that scores of thousands of people will stand in the rain and cold for hours to hear him in person. The only person in that country since Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom that could be said. He has a huge following. It's a tainted election. And as far as he's concerned, it's just round two of the Trump wars. And it'll abate for a while, but it'll continue.
Well, let me just ask you, though, because you have said that no president, save for FDR, Lincoln, and Nixon, has accomplished more than Donald Trump while in office. So how do you make sense of the results of the election?
There was such a focus for 4 years of an almost unanimous media and denigrating and defaming the president that it did stir up a lot of anti-Trump votes. Now, his followers rallied, and as your intro said, he did get 74 million votes. And there are real doubts about how these votes went in 4 of the Democratic governed states that had rather latitudinarian views of how to verify ballots that were posted, but supposedly in response to the COVID crisis. But so the answer is there was a great Trump hate vote, but he still is by far the most popular and the most unpopular person politically in the country. But when he's out of office, as he seemingly will be, he'll maintain his supporters, but the media won't be able to spend 24 hours a day for 4 years attacking him because he won't be the president.
Bob, what do you make of the fact that Biden's victory wasn't a landslide?
Well, number one, by American standards, it was a landslide. What was just said about the election being tainted is absolute nonsense. It is very clear Republican officials at state levels, at county levels, governors, at national levels, right across the country have been certifying this election. He will win by the same amount of votes that Trump did in the last election, which they called a landslide in the Electoral College. So let's dispense with that nonsense right off the top. This was a very clean election. He did very well. He did very well in the election right across the board. U.S. elections are always close, and by U.S. standards, this is a very good, clean win. So that's point number one. Point number two, I would say, is we're going to have, I think, a good relationship with the U.S. over the next period of time, mainly because there'll be stability in the relationship. The folks in global affairs in Ottawa and the PMO and others are happy that they can wake up and not know what sort of missile has been sent their way that day. So I think they're looking forward to a degree of stability in the relationship. The next thing is there'll be some adults back in the White House, which will be a nice change of the last 4 years too as well. And also a number of them who know Canada intimately. His deputy chief of staff, as an example, worked on Mr. Trudeau's campaign, his last one. His chief economic advisor ran the Canada desk in the Obama White House, so on and so forth through the line. So they know us. They've got a good idea of who we are. There's less of a learning curve than there was last time out, which I think will be helpful for us by and large. There'll be bumps along the way, particularly on trade and economic issues, but it will be dealt with in an adult manner, and that will be a welcome change.
Conrad, did you want to respond to Bob?
Yeah, it was certainly not a landslide. No one said that the previous election was a landslide. That was a joke.
Well, actually, Mr. Trump did.
No, please, allow me to respond. That was a comment he made about the Electoral College. He said it was a good margin there. He understood that he trailed Mrs. Clinton in the popular vote. That happens in the U.S. It's happened 5 times prior to that, when the winning candidate had fewer votes than the chief opponent. Now, it was a margin of about 3 or 4%. There's no doubt Biden won the popular vote. As I say, that happens. But it's also true that there is a real question about a few of these states. I mean, you had a sudden shutdown of counting. You had drops in the dead of night in 3 or 4 states, overwhelmingly lopsided where the
Nonsense.
mailed-in ballot, if I may, where the mailed-in ballots were mixed up with the others, and it's impossible to verify them. I'm not saying it was illegal, but it's questionable. And the polls show that even a third of the Democrats question the result, and the great majority of Republicans do. It'll go ahead. That's not the issue. Biden won the popular vote. I'm not saying he's an illegitimate president. I said it was a tainted election. If they hadn't fiddled around with the rules, Trump would have won, and he would have won the same way he did before, the same way Kennedy won in 1960. You work the Electoral College, and you don't have to win the popular vote. That happens.
If there was any
I'm not saying
taint,
it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it changes the atmosphere.
if there was any taint in this election, it probably has more to do with voter suppression than it has to do with technical issues on election day, which were massive.
The tormenting of the Postmaster General by voter suppression amounted to nothing. There was no voter suppression. It was like Russian interference. It didn't happen. It was just lies from the Democratic
voters
media.
in Texas who had one ballot box in advance polls in a district with 4 million people. That's voter suppression.
I think
clear,
part of the point, though, Marissa,
unambiguous.
Adrian.
Part of the point to your question, though, I think more broadly, is that over the last 4.5 years, we have been told, Trump is the worst president, he's despised, he is all of these things. And if you were to believe all of that rhetoric, and if you were to believe all the pollsters, then Joe Biden should have had an 84 Reagan-style election with winning every state but one. But I think what we fail to recognize is that President Trump was more of he's a movement more than a moment, and that language and what he represented for 74 million Americans. They're not racist, they're not misogynist, they're not sexist. They just looked at their bottom line, and they looked at this man as president, and their life wasn't worse off under him. And so I think that if we step back for a second, we can look at the margin here or there. Look, Joe Biden's president. He's going to get sworn in a month's time. But it is worthwhile exploring how things were so wrong, and how people continue to scratch their head and wonder, how did 74 million people vote for this guy? He's despised. Well, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. He's not. And so there was that quiet, secret Trump vote that they weren't going to say to anybody who they were supporting. And of course, the Democrats, focused on the mail-in ballots. Republicans focused on day of vote. Maybe that was a mistake on the behalf of the Republicans, but I think it's important to put that context in there.
All right, we'll pick that up on the other side of the break, so don't go away.
There is a belief that by millions of people that did vote, that there is something wrong with their system.
Welcome back. While President Trump has yet to concede the election, he has agreed to let Biden's transition process officially proceed. And when asked if he would leave the White House if the Electoral College votes for Biden, Trump said, "Certainly I will." In the meantime, he presses on with efforts to overturn results in key states. Peter, Trump has acknowledged that the fight to overturn his reelection probably won't rise to the Supreme Court. So what options are left for the president?
Look, I think, frankly, there are none. And with all due respect to Mr. Black, I mean, on legal grounds, no one really thinks that the election was tainted to the degree that it has to be overturned. Bill Barr doesn't think that. The Attorney General, the Department of Homeland Security doesn't think that. Now 3 or 4 dozen courts don't think that. So for Mr. Trump, I mean, it's got to be remarkably hard for him. I mean, just at a personal level, to lose an election. I think it's hard for anyone who does it. And in fairness, he spent the last 4 years under a barrage. So he had hoped to win this, and he was going to rallies at the end where there were thousands of people adoringly seeing him. So I imagine that he's still kind of processing this. And look, I get the impression he's not a guy who's ever liked losing any time in his life. But at some point, it's going to dawn on him that he's got to leave. And I hope, actually, for his own sake, that he leaves the office with some magnanimity to leave on a better note than on a worse one.
Adrian, 50 million people believe that there was fraud. 70% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump believe that this election was rigged. What does America look like under those circumstances?
just a few days before Election Day, all of us in the media were captured and just seized by this notion of businesses all around the country boarding themselves up, shutting themselves down beyond what they were doing for the coronavirus, but just, boarding up because they were worried that there were going to be a violent reaction to the presidency. And if it was President Trump, then, of course, the left would take to the streets and riot and loot and do all the things that the left is known to do over the course of the last how many years. But that never happened because, Joe Biden, became the president. But there still is a question mark. And you say 70% of Republicans still have that question mark because they know how they voted. They know how they talk to each other. They know how their neighbors voted. So they do wonder whether or not this was as fair and clean as it should have been. 4 years ago, we heard day after day after day, hour after hour on CNN. Who knows what the hell they're going to do with themselves for the next 4 years? But we heard constantly Russian interference, Russian interference. Well, is it possible there was a question regarding domestic challenges? Was there concerns about these ballot boxes? And I'm not going to go down the road of the conspiracy theory. I'm not going to go down that. I'm just simply saying there is a belief that by millions of people that did vote, that there is something wrong with their system. And that is a challenge that the Democrats are going to have to deal with come the next 4 years. It's not just in the U.S., though, Conrad. 1 in 5 Canadians believe that this election was rigged. So, I guess my question is Trump going away, which earlier you said you didn't think he was, but what's the likelihood of on the day that Biden is inaugurated, Donald Trump announces he's running for re-election, 4 years of rallies, fraud, 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 fraud. I mean, is that what we're headed for?
Well, it requires mind reading. I think that's a possibility, but I think it's just as likely that that he'll go without just keeping his options open and leave it that way, as he has every right to do, for as long as he wants, and decide later what he wants to do. But where I do take issue with the gentleman in glasses, it's perfect. As I said, we agree what the result of the election is, but you can't simply ignore the fact that in 4 Democrat-governed states, substantial amounts of key votes from a few urban counties came in the middle of the night in lopsided amounts, and they're unable to reconcile the voting list with the mailed ballots that came. Now, I think we have to remember the United States is not a gentle country. It's a jungle. It's its strength and its weakness. But in the case of Trump, they started on day one, the day after the election, with snide press releases from the DNC about the government knows how to evict trespassers from the White House, as if Trump was going to cling to the furniture on Inauguration Day. This is all nonsense. All of it was nonsense. If he loses the electoral vote, he leaves. But on the other hand, it is a hamstrung government. Biden is not at the top of his powers. Nobody voted for him. He had no campaign. The media made the campaign. People voted for or against Trump, and substantial numbers of them were whipped up to a kind of Emmanuel Goldstein level of fervor by the media, rabid partisanship, and it's a somewhat artificial situation. Well, Trump will assess it, and if he wants to make a comeback, he's certainly capable of making a very strenuous comeback. And this government is going to have a very difficult time getting anything done. They are not going to get any of the radical measures through. And they played footsie with a bunch of urban guerrillas all summer, whom they didn't mention, as they ransacked and in their peaceful protest did billions of dollars of damage all around Democratic governed cities in the country. And Joe Biden is not, he's not Franklin D. Roosevelt, is a leader of the people, and it's a coalition of disparate elements, and they don't have the Congress, and they don't have the country, and they have no mandate to do anything radical. So I think it's going to be a gong show, but Trump won't be the problem.
Peter, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think it's just worth noting. Maybe we can move on from was the election tainted question, but there's a very good reason why the votes were counted, the mail-in ballots were counted in Pennsylvania after the election, and that's that the Republican Party petitioned the court to not allow the votes to begin to be counted before the election. So it's just, I mean, there's no mystery why it takes all night to count hundreds of thousands of mail-in ballots, because they weren't allowed to start counting them until the polls closed. So, I mean, I think that's just plain as day. To Mr. Black's point, though, I mean, I think that he's right to underline that Trump is a unique political force, and I think where he goes and how the party deals with him, whether it tries to box him out or whether it allows him to retain his capture on the Republican Party, is going to occupy the next couple of years. I think the other thing to note, right, is that there's still serious questions about whether Mr. Biden is going to run for a second term, and to Conrad's point, there's a real question, I think, about how much Biden can get done, and if he signals that he's not going to run for a second term, or he's not decisive about his desire to run for a second term, the kind of machinations in the Democratic Party to determine his successor will begin, within months, not years. So I think he actually has, to agree with Conrad, has a very short window, very small window, and a short time span to actually get things done. So it's not going to be easy for him, whether his election was a landslide or not. It's not easy for him for the next 4 years.
And Bob, I'll just give you the final word here.
Well, yeah, look, number one, I think this was a very, by American standards, a very clean election, surprisingly enough. And I think Joe Biden does have a mandate to move forward in govern, despite attempts by a number of people to suggest that he doesn't. I think this will be a government that will have to do probably a number of executive orders on things to get things moving. They do control the House, albeit by a smaller margin, and the Senate, even if the other two seats go in Georgia, is effectively 50-50. So neither of the two parties really can say that they are wildly in charge here. So hopefully, given his record of 40 years of public service and being known to a number of senators, there may be an opportunity here to actually work together to see if they can get a few things done. They'll get a few things done, hopefully. There'll be some big things that they won't be able to get done because there's no consensus. But I think Joe Biden may strangely be the right guy in the right place at the right time. History will tell, but I think he's got the right sort of experience and knowledge and understanding of the U.S. system that was completely lacking in the previous president to hopefully be able to bring some people together and try to get some things done.
All right, when we come back, Canada-U.S. trade relations under a Biden presidency. That's next.
Trump never had any grievance against Canada. He liked Canada, and he always did business profitably here.
Welcome back. While Biden and Trump represent two markedly different futures for America, one economic policy that has echoes of the Trump playbook is Biden's Buy American slogan. This commitment, coupled with the Democrats' tradition of being more protectionist, begs the question, how will Biden change U.S.-Canada trade relations? Peter.
Well, there's a couple of things to look at here. So one is how that Buy American policy is actually going to be put in place. The USMCA, I think, is best, the new NAFTA is best described basically as trying to create a trading bloc throughout North America. And if Biden sort of sees the United States, Mexico and Canada as being partners of the United States in this and gives us broad exceptions, we should be okay. If he tries to aggressively pursue a Buy American strategy, then USMCA gets put to the test for its ability to enforce basically trade within North America. The other piece of it, though, to watch, and this I think is equally important because there's some very political elements and there's some economic elements, is what Biden does around TPP, what he does around trade with China. We're in a real squeeze right now in Canada, not an existential one yet, but a very tight grip between China and the United States. The flashpoint is the arrest and the extradition request for Meng Wanzhou, the detention of the two Michaels in China, but it goes as well just to Canada's trading relationship with China and the United States. So whether President Biden tries to extricate and help Canada get out of that situation, or whether he leaves us to dangle in the wind, as we are right now and struggling to get out of it, is going to be a kind of a first test of how much we mix politics and trade with the United States.
Conrad, I think that there's this sort of misconception that Donald Trump has been the single source friction between Canada and the U.S. over the course of the last 4 years. But in fact, Canada and the U.S. have a fairly extensive history of trade disputes, softwood lumber. We've had tariffs on aluminum before. Did we not?
Yes, we did. But again, I agree with what the previous speaker said. And indeed, in general, I defer to him in trade matters. But the real problem the U.S. had with the North American, the NAFTA, was that with the Mexicans, you had this situation of 500,000 to 1 million of them entering illegally each year. And the Mexicans enticing American factories across the border to set up 10 miles south of the border and then export product back into the US and export unemployment into the US and then take the income from the fugitive Mexicans back into Mexico and encourage American companies in Mexico to keep their profits in Mexico and not repatriate them to the US. And beyond a certain point, in the circumstances, it was really a pretty provocative position that the Mexicans were taking. And that was really the Trump grievance. As a sideshow, I don't want to diminish us in our own self-estimation as Canadians, but as a sideshow, the Americans threw in a few minor annoyances towards Canada. But what the Mexicans were doing was something that no great power would tolerate. I think it'll be fine. I mean, yes, of course, there are frictions in various trade areas, but Canada and the US always resolve them. I mean, the correlation of forces is what it is. I think this government, this Trudeau government, has, despite some of Christia's uncalled for asides, handled the portfolio well, handled the task well. I don't see any great problem with the Democrats in this. They'll be a little easier to deal with than Trump, but Trump wasn't. I mean, Trump never had any grievance against Canada. He liked Canada and he always did business profitably here.
Bob, Adrian, do you think that there's any appetite among a Biden administration to open USMCA?
No, I don't think so. I think it's generally working well. Let's remember it was approved by the Democratic House of Representatives. I think it's viewed as a relatively positive thing that is going on. I agree. I agree with Peter too as well. I think generally trade is in a decent situation. We're going to have a couple of bumps on the road. I think Keystone is going to be tough. John Kerry was opposed in the last Democratic administration to Keystone when he was Secretary of State. He's now the special envoy for the environment. He will be back to haunt us, I believe, on that issue. Buy America still remains to be defined. There could be some issues there. But our two biggest exports to them are oil. We will get that to market, Keystone or no Keystone. And the second is car parts. And again, that one has just been pretty much finalized through USMCA. So I think we're in relatively good shape. And when you do 65 or 75% of your trade with somebody, it's good to have stability in the relationship. And that's likely will be returned with a Biden presidency.
All right, we'll pick that up on the other side of the break when we look at what a Biden win means for Canada's energy sector. We'll discuss.
There's just an extraordinary amount of frustration. West of Ontario, they want to see Trudeau stand up for our energy sector against the new president.
Welcome back. Joe Biden campaigned on a promise to tear up the permits for the Keystone XL pipeline over climate concerns, while Trump firmly backed it. Keystone would carry more than 800,000 barrels per day of crude oil from Alberta to refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast and would provide thousands of jobs to Albertans. So what does this mean for the future of Canada's energy industry? Adrian, I'll start with you. Can we assume that a Biden win will be problematic for Alberta, Saskatchewan, the West Coast?
Yes, I think it will be a big challenge. I think that there's going to be a significant amount of push and pull from from Ottawa to the United States about this. Not the least of which, of course, is the new role of John Kerry. We knew he was against the Keystone XL. President Obama was against it. But there's a lot of Americans, millions of Americans, who rely on our oil and gas development. But the Democrats have factions within their own party about what their priority is for who they are, what they represent. And there's a very loud and sadly successful wing of that party, Marissa, that is dominating the rhetoric, and that is, of course, the anti-development crowd. They're against oil and gas. They're against all this development. So Joe Biden has a challenge within his own party and what he is going to be able to do with his own presidency. I do feel this is where his vice president Kamala Harris can be helpful, but there's certainly going to be a problem for the Trudeau Liberals if we are unable to continue to develop our oil and gas. And it's not just Keystone XL, to be sure. There's frustration with a whole bunch of other resource development that has gone undeveloped, or the federal government bought a pipeline for billions and it went nowhere. So there's just an extraordinary amount of frustration, west of Ontario, where there are no Liberal MPs from Manitoba West, that they're being left out of the Confederation. They're left out of Canada, and they want to see Trudeau stand up for our energy sector against the new president.
And you're right, but Keystone is a big one, Bob. The Alberta government has poured $1.5 billion into it. It would mean thousands of jobs for Albertans. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer, a major exporter to the United States, and Biden makes these claims that he's looking to transition away from the oil industry. What does that mean for our sector? What does that mean for us?
Well, I think number one, the federal government needs to work very hard to support the Keystone pipeline. I'm a supporter of it. I think the Prime Minister is a strong supporter of it, and others. And I think they're going to have to really work to try to get that done. I think it's going to be a tall order, given who is in the United States on that issue. But it is something that the government should do. I would like to note, for fairness, that there's a little bit of an amnesia among conservatives when it comes to pipelines. In the previous Harper government that was there for 10 years, not one single foot of pipeline was built to Tidewater. So let's also set reasonable standards and reasonable expectations for government. So that would be one point. Second point I would make is there are 12 Liberal MPs in British Columbia, and last time I checked, that's past the Manitoba border. But there are none in Saskatchewan and Alberta. I will concede that point to you, Adrian. There are none in Saskatchewan and Alberta. It has more to do with a whole variety of issues, not just pipelines. And this government has done a variety of things, including the trans pipeline that they have been working on. And they're also dealing with a very tough situation globally when it comes to oil that Alberta is not exempt from. So I think this is going to be a tough issue. There's no question about it. But I think the federal government is going to have to knuckle down and really get to work supporting the Keystone.
All right. On that note, there's more after the break. Stay tuned.
Some variation of what Trump has done, of putting economic heat on China and reminding the Chinese that the United States is a more powerful country.
Welcome back. We've been discussing how a Biden presidency will impact Canada. While Trump was in office, his immigration policies included the construction of a 400-mile wall between the U.S. and Mexican border, multiple visa restrictions in an effort to maximize jobs for Americans, and a travel freeze due to the COVID pandemic. So how will Biden's approach differ? Bob, I'll start with you. Why not start with the border?
Well, number one, I would say that the approach that he's taken on immigration has been a bit of a boon to us here. Here in the city of Toronto, as an example, we've gained thousands and thousands of people that otherwise would have probably gone to Silicon Valley in our technology sector. So I think it's about to get a lot more competitive again in the technology sector, as an example, with a Biden presidency. So that's one benefit that was inadvertent, but was very helpful during the Trump presidency. I think on immigration, I agree with a comment that Lord Black made earlier. I think the Democrats are going to moderate themselves. I don't think you're going to see massive open borders. I think American public opinion has moved on that issue as a result of the Trump presidency. And I think that there will be a more moderate but still cautious approach on the issue of immigration.
I want to turn our attention to relations with China because we just have a few minutes left. But of course, you know, the United States' own tensions with China increased during the COVID outbreak and, of course, the ongoing trade war between the two countries. But then, you know, Canada's relationship with China has also been strained, in part because of the CFO of Huawei and then, of course, the arrest of the two Canadians. How does all that play out, Peter?
Well, I think that story is yet to be written. We're in a box, and the box essentially is that the United States has issued a legal extradition order to request the extradition of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. They have grounds for those charges. It appears Canadian courts have asserted that there are grounds for those charges. And despite the recommendations of any number of so-called eminent experts in Canada that we just trade Meng Wanzhou for the two Michaels who have been detained on less reasonable grounds, this thing is going to play out as a legal matter. I think what we can hope for is that the U.S. government decides to reach some sort of settlement with Huawei, which would see Meng Wanzhou return to China, would see Huawei pay a large fine, for example, and then we can deal with the issue of the detention of the two Michaels. But you know, this is something where, you know, I don't think there's an issue that has demonstrated the unseriousness of Canada in its foreign policy better than this one, and the actions that have been taken by a number of Canadians who have suggested that we should engage in a prisoner swap, which is to say that if China doesn't like what we do, they can take Canadians hostage and then negotiate with bodies, is, I think, just incredibly damaging to our foreign policy. It imperils every Canadian who's doing business in China or who's traveling there for pleasure. So, you know, this thing's going to get resolved, but we need to take a very, very hard look in the mirror to figure out how we relate to China. And I would just say, if people really want to get into it, look at how Australia has dealt with China, with Chinese interference, with the 5G issue, with Huawei, and look at how Australia has treated the United States today versus how we are. And then I'll give you a hint of what a strong, principled, constructive relationship with China can look like, which doesn't characterize our relationship with that country right now.
Conrad, how would you describe the U.S.'s relationship with China under Trump, and how will that change under Biden?
This is the rivalry of a great nation with other nations. The reference to Australia, I think, is interesting. They're part of this Quad arrangement where they're really linked in with the United States, India, and Japan. I think we should look at joining that, because we're just as much an Asian nation as the USA is, and slot our policy into a side we can agree with that gives us a stronger negotiating position. And I think ultimately one assumes that the Americans and the Chinese will resolve the greater differences between them. And you can only do it by some variation of what Trump has done, of putting economic heat on China and reminding the Chinese that the United States is a more powerful country. I mean, China has almost no resources. It's extremely dependent on importation of natural resources. And the Americans have a lot of levers they can play. Well, I think if they, obviously the Biden administration will be additionally sensitive because of the controversial commercial relations that members of the president-elect's family had with that country. And so I think that the two most important countries in the world will negotiate with each other, and we should try and slot ourselves into that so that we get an umbrella to deal with these things. But henceforth, I think we should join a larger group in the relationship of China with the West, instead of trying to do it ourselves and being always left out and reduced to people saying, and I agree with Peter, completely absurd things like we should just ignore the extradition treaty with the US, and anytime we have a dispute, the Chinese will take some of our people and we'll resolve it by getting them back. Well, incidentally, I don't think we should have an extradition treaty with the United States, but we do, and as long as we do, we have to pay some attention to it.
All right, well, when we come back, we'll hear some final thoughts from our panelists. Welcome back. With only a few minutes left, Our panelists will leave you with some of their final thoughts. Adrian, we'll start with you.
Well, I think that it's going to be generally neutral for the President Biden with the federal Liberals. For Canadians that are expecting, some sea change, I don't think that that's going to be coming. I think it's going to be quite status quo with a few challenges here and there. Most notably, what we've already referred to in terms of our energy sector and Keystone XL and things. With respect to trade, I think will be again nothing too sudden, nothing too big. So I don't think that they will be enraptured and encapsulated on their television screens with what a Biden presidency did, like they did with a Trump presidency. Their Twitter feeds will cool down quite a lot. But it won't be a perfect presidency by any stretch of the means in terms of what we will see in 4 years' time. Biden's got big challenges ahead of him, not only internally but around the world. And if he gets just a handful of those things correct, then it will be a success.
All right, Peter.
Most of our problems have nothing to do with the United States. They have to do with our own inability to get things done. So if we can take the next 3 or 4 years and the stability that a Biden presidency might offer and really get serious about doing big things in our country again, rather than just, watching America smugly and with self-satisfaction, I think we'll be all the better for it.
Bob?
I think there'll be a return of stability in the relationship, in the Canada-U.S. Relationship, which I think is good. I think there's an opportunity here to grow and strengthen the relationship too as well, that perhaps didn't exist in the last 4 years, where I think the Trudeau government viewed themselves a little bit as walking on eggshells, dealing with the Trump presidency. And I thought that they did a pretty good job dealing with that. So I think there's an opportunity here, but there will be bumps along the way. There's no question about that, particularly on economic issues.
And Conrad?
The country is still in flux. The entrenched establishment fought back against Trump, but Trump hasn't gone away, and they have, frankly, an unprepossessing leader of a sort of house of Babel of factions that don't get on with each other. And apart from occupying the White House, they can't really call the tune anywhere else. And so the Americans will sort it out. It's a unique country operating on a scale the world hasn't seen before, and it resolves things as it does. And it's not always resolved according to any rule book. It's essentially who has the money and who has the votes. I think we can all take a rest from Trump for a while, including Trump himself.
That's all the time we have. Thank you to my panelists for being here and for you at home watching. For now, it's time to zoom out.